This has really been a wild show, and we are so blessed today to be joined by international correspondent, former CBS News journalist David Andelman, director of the World Policy Institute. We had a horrible event today with a bombing of a school in Pakistan, and the list of terrorism and events created to terrorism just goes on and on and on. David wrote a book called A Shattered Peace, Versailles 1919 and the Price We Pay Today, where he's drawn some incredible connections between what happened 100 years ago and what's happening today. And David, it's an honor to have you. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
And I guess my first question, I'm driving down today and I'm listening on CBS radio to the bombing with respect to the school in Pakistan, and the events of close to 100 years ago with the Treaty of Versailles. You have made a very strong case that what we're seeing today actually started close to 100 years ago. Can you explain that for us?
Well, yes. I mean, the problem with the Treaty of Versailles was that nobody really understood the lands that they were dividing up. The winners at Versailles, that is to say the Americans, the British, the French, the Italians, they all came to Versailles with the aim of destroying Germany, destroying the Ottoman Empire, which were the enemy. And that meant fracturing certainly the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire, remember, stretched from Turkey all the way across the Middle East into North Africa. And what they began doing was they began creating countries out of this area by just dividing it up on a map, but having no understanding of the people or the religions that they were dividing. So they had no understanding of the difference between Shiites and Sunnis or Kurds or anybody else. And the result was that they created these artificial countries that were an amalgam of people that have traditionally hated each other for a millennium, for 1,000 years at least, and that we're not going to get any friendlier towards each other. So while Pakistan itself was not part of the treaty discussions, the British Empire was, and that was at that point in time part of the British Empire. So when they divided up the areas of the Middle East, the Shiites, the Sunnis, and so on, they set the stage for all of the conflicts, or many of the conflicts that take place today, by not understanding the kinds of countries that needed to be created, more homogeneous countries that would have been a Shiite area of Iraq and a Sunni area of Iraq, or a real Kurdistan. And now we're instead divided between 3 or 4 different countries, each fragmented and each hostile to each other.
It's a fascinating subject, and Woodrow Wilson and his presidency, you know, something as far as, at least in modern times, at least me, being one who perhaps studied history over 40 years ago, I was always fascinated with him. I never thought he got the, shall we say, the airspace that perhaps some of the later presidents did. Was he a hopeless idealist? Was he a great statesman? Was he tricked and befuddled at this conference? How would you describe him?
Part of each of those. He was an idealist. I wouldn't say a hopeless idealist. He had great hopes for what he brought the United States into the war to accomplish. And remember, he brought the United States into the war on the basis of what he called his 14 points, his principles of what the world should look like at the end. He regarded this, and indeed most of the Western allies regarded this, as the war to end all wars. This is supposed to be the war that really created a lasting and eternal peace.
Right.
To be administered by an organization called the League of Nations, which is today's equivalent of the United Nations. It never worked. It never worked partly because Wilson never laid the basis at home for the ratification of the treaty and the creation of the League. So the League was created, but without the United States even joining in on it. So the result was it became an empty shell. There was no real organization that could police all of the different aspects of the treaty that was created in 1919, and which did lay the basis for, in theory, for a world of peace. It was very badly divided, that world, but nevertheless, it might have worked had there been an organization really to oversee this, and there wasn't.
It's a fascinating thing. Now, the way you describe this treaty conference, I was taken by the words of the diplomat Harold Nicholson. Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Wilson as if they were dividing a cake. He was appalled. And it was this, shall we say, meeting in this time of great pageantry. Sarah Bernhardt was there and several others. And I can only imagine, would you have liked to have reported on it? You probably would have laid across the table, I can only imagine.
Oh, I would have given anything to have been there. I'll tell you, the entire world descended on that place, on Paris in those few months in 1919. It was really an extraordinary location. I mean, some of the great generals of World War II. Eisenhower was there as a young colonel. Patton was there. There were a whole bunch of very, very interesting people. On the social side, Elsa Maxwell, the great party giver,
right.
She was there. Marcel Proust went every night to the Ritz Hotel to have dinner there, and he was waited on by a Vietnamese busboy named Nguyen Thach Thanh, when he was really basically dissed for his desire to create an independent Vietnam, went up to Moscow, turned communist, and became Ho Chi Minh. So, the whole world was really there in some fashion or other. So it would have been a fascinating place to report on. Unfortunately, most of the press had very little understanding of what was going on behind those closed doors. For the historian or for the writer 100 years later, what was very valuable was everybody who was involved in that conference kept diaries in those days. There was no email, there were no text messages and that sort of thing. But there were these diaries that were kept, and they're quite fascinating because they took me behind the doors of all of these deliberations to see how ill-informed everybody was, but how Byzantine the machinations were of the negotiations and the trading and back and forth. And that was something, by the way, you're coming back to Wilson, that was something Wilson was not very good at. What Wilson should have done was he should have stayed at home in Washington. He should have laid the basis with the Republicans like Henry Cabot Lodge and the leader of the Republicans in the Senate to form that treaty and to ratify that treaty, and let the negotiators, people like Colonel Edward House, who was his deputy, let them negotiate the treaty in France, because they were much more Machiavellian. They thought a lot more like the leaders of the Western powers that were determined to pull the wool over Wilson's eyes. It was a bit of an innocent in all of this.
Sure.
So it was very badly conceived, the American approach to it, and certainly Wilson's approach to it.
What fascinated me, and when you think of 1919 and then 1939 with the outbreak of the Second World War, and then the 1960s with all the horrible problems in Indochina, I could, from what I could surmise, Indochina during this whole event was, I wouldn't even call them, me, myself, and I, an afterthought. And can you comment on that?
Well, it was very much of an afterthought. One of the reasons was that the four major powers agreed not to touch the territories of each of their respective allies, so that the French, their territories in Indochina, the French remember controlled all of Indochina at that point. Their colonies like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they were safe. Equally, the British colonies in Africa and in Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so forth, they were all safe. No one was going to mess with them. So that, in effect, that guaranteed that none of these other countries, which were real countries, could even begin to move toward independence as a result of this conference. Like, for instance, parts of the Ottoman Empire that did begin to move towards independence, although it was an independence that was not very well constructed. So, it is kind of sad, because there were people like Ho Chi Minh, or whatever it was called in those days, Nguyen Thach Thanh, who would come to Paris to try desperately to campaign for independence for their countries, to get out from under the French boot heel, if you will, that had been strangling their people, and were just basically told to go fly a kite.
It's fascinating. In our closing moments, projecting this forward, and we have about maybe a minute and a half. Today's event, reaching back all the way to 1919, what might be your greatest concern in 2015 for the geopolitical situation as it reaches out far and wide?
My concern is that we not learn from the lessons of the past. What we really need to do is we really need to unbundle everything that had been done wrong back in those days. One of the things that they created
fascinating information, a fascinating book, a shattered piece. Versailles 1919 and the price we pay today would make an excellent Christmas gift. David, I'm so grateful to have you today, and thank you so much.
Tony, it's also a new centenary edition with a fabulous introduction by Sir Harold Evans, who is the husband of Tina Brown.
And that's a wonderful thing. I am going to buy that myself, and I encourage my viewers to do the same. You can find David on the web at the World Policy Institute. And David, thanks so much, and have a wonderful holiday season.
And to you as well.
Thank you, sir. And that's it. December 16th.
Thank you very much. I hope that was of some value.
It was. Thanks so much, David.
I'm glad to help. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
And a wonderful interview with David Andelman, and we'll be winding up this show December 16, 2014 on Connecticut Morning, but we're coming back on Friday with law professor Joe Montanillo and the 10 most dangerous toys in the marketplace. You got to be here. See you then. Thanks so much for being with us, and have a great day.